How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. And in this video, we're going to jump into our in-depth study of Neville Goddard's book, Out of This World, written in the year 1948. The reason I love this book so much is that it really lays out some of the foundational concepts and principles that we can really utilize to execute and to actually implement so much of what Neville talks about in many of his other books. I find this book to be really foundational. Talks about, assumptions turning into facts, talks about the power of imagination. In this opening chapter here that we're going to jump into, chapter 1, is about thinking fourth dimensionally, which is something that Neville references throughout a lot of his work. And one of the things about Neville's work in general is that obviously Neville was a highly intelligent person, very spiritual person. And if you really study his writing, it takes a while to really understand and interpret what he's saying, let alone actually implement it, which is, I think, one of the reasons that his work has not become as popular as some of the other writers out there, right? Think like the Napoleon Hills of our world, whose work really, gained widespread notability and notoriety. And so with Neville's work, it's a little bit more intellectual, a bit more abstract sometimes in how he writes and how he's teaching. And so that's one of the reasons that I am excited to, dive into these books to create some in-depth analyses for you. And I also find that for myself, when I teach this stuff, when I really dive into it and study it in this manner, in a way that I have to explain it and sort of, share my own thoughts and reflections with you, I find that it helps me to learn this more in depth. And whenever I want to learn something really, really well, I just go out and teach it. Because I find that when I teach something, I really cement and take my level of internal understanding to the next level. So without further ado, we're going to just dive in here. We're going to go chapter by chapter, starting with chapter 1 of Neville's 1948 work, Out of This World. Let's just hop on over to the book here. So chapter 1 is called Thinking Fourth Dimensionally. He starts off with this quote from John chapter 14, verse 29. Says, "And now I have told you before it come to pass, that when it is come to pass, ye might believe." Let's dive into the chapter. Neville says that many persons, myself included, have observed events before they occurred. That is, before they occurred in this world of three dimensions. Since man can observe an event before it occurs in the three dimensions of space, life on Earth must proceed according to plan, and this plan must exist elsewhere in another dimension and be slowly moving through our space. If the occurring events were not in this world when they were observed, then to be perfectly logical, they must have been out of this world. And whatever is there to be seen before it occurs here must be predetermined from the point of view of man awake in a three-dimensional world. So what Neville's really trying to explain and communicate to us here is that we can, in imagination, which he gets into in a lot more depth in the next chapter, in chapter 2, but we can, with imagination, create our future. We can predetermine our future. And in fact, that if we can learn to think what he describes as fourth dimensionally, then we can actually create our reality in the three-dimensional physical world that we're observing with our five senses. We can create that reality before it occurs. And really the number one asset that you have in order to do that, as you'll find out, and as you probably already know, is in fact your imagination. But it's truly learning to discipline your attention and imagination that's going to allow you to actually implement these ideas and principles and actually construct your future reality in your imagination before you experience it in physical form. Let's continue here. Thus, the question arises, are we able to alter our future? My object in writing these pages is to indicate possibilities inherent to man, to show that man can alter his future. But thus altered, it forms again a deterministic sequence starting from the point of interference, a future that will be consistent with the alteration. The most remarkable feature of man's future is its flexibility. It is determined by his attitudes rather than by his acts. I believe this is a huge concept. He's saying that your future, the quality of your future, the nature of your future, Future events are determined not so much by the physical things that you're doing, not so much by what you're doing, but by your attitudes. Now, what does Neville mean by your attitudes? Well, your personality, who you are. Dr. Joe Dispenza says your personality creates your personal reality. So what are the elements that make up your personality? It's your thoughts, it's your feelings, it's what you're imagining, it's what you're thinking, and it's how you perceive the world and how you conceive yourself, right? Your concept of self. And your personality dictates your personal reality. That's exactly what Neville is saying here in chapter 1 of Out of This World. Right back in 1948, Neville's talking about this, right? So it's your attitudes rather than your acts that actually most works to shape your future. The cornerstone, I'm going to continue reading, the cornerstone on which all things are based is man's concept of himself. He acts as he does and has the experiences that he does because his concept of himself is what it is, and for no other reason, right? This is huge. It's your concept of self. You conceive and then you believe. Conceive, believe, and then achieve, ultimately, right? So how do you conceive yourself? What is the idea of yourself that you're creating? And what Neville teaches that at any moment, in an instant, you can shift, you can transform, you can alter your concept of self. Let's continue here. Had he a different concept of self, he would act differently. A change of concept of self automatically alters his future. And a change in any term of his future series of experiences reciprocally alters his concept of self. Man's assumptions, which he regards as insignificant, let me do that again. So what he's saying is, man's assumptions, which he regards as insignificant, produce effects that are considerable. Therefore, man should revise his estimate of an assumption and recognize its creative power. So Neville's really working here in the opening chapter to communicate the importance of our assumptions. What are we assuming about ourselves? What are we believing about who we are, how we conceive ourselves? Let's continue. All changes take place in consciousness. The future, although prepared in every detail in advance, has several outcomes. At every moment of our lives, we have before us the choice of which of several futures we will choose. There are two actual outlooks on the world possessed by everyone, a natural focus and a spiritual focus. The ancient teachers called the one the carnal mind and the other the mind of Christ. Let's continue on here. He says, we may differentiate them as ordinary waking consciousness governed by our senses, right? That's the carnal mind. And a controlled imagination governed by desire. Now, the ancient teachers, as Neville said here, called that the mind of Christ. So what he's saying is that at any moment, you can choose which mind, right, you are implementing, that you are using. We can differentiate between them as ordinary waking consciousness, right, or controlled imagination. And it's learning to control the imagination, which is the underlying sort of foundational cornerstone of all of Neville Goddard's teachings. Learning how to control your imagination for the purposes of creating your desired outcome, right? Law of assumption, assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. So let's continue on here. We recognize these two distinct centers of thought in this statement. The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolish. For they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, for they are spiritually discerned. The natural view confines reality to the moment called now. To the natural view, the past and future are purely imaginary. Neville talks about this a lot, right? That your past and your future are really constructs. They're imaginary constructs. They are not real, right? That all that is real is right here and now in your three-dimensional world. The spiritual view, let's continue on here. The spiritual view, on the other hand, sees the contents of time. It sees events as distinct and separated as objects in space. The past and future are a present whole to the spiritual view. What is mental and subjective to the natural man is concrete and objective to the spiritual man. The habit of seeing only that which our senses permit renders us totally blind to what we otherwise could see. I think this statement is massive. I'm going to read that one again. You really got to process this. The habit of seeing only that which our senses permit renders us totally blind to what we otherwise could see, right? Because if we are only allowing our perception of what is real to be governed by what we can see, taste, touch, smell, right? By our five senses and feel, if we're restricting our perception of what is real and what is possible to what is coming in through the five senses, what Neville's saying is that is severely restricting the possibilities of your future. That is severely restricting what you can create, what you can achieve, right? Renders us totally blind to what we otherwise could see. So we cannot fall victim to this habit, which we all, of course, do at times. We really want to work to transcend the habit of seeing only that which our five senses permit. Let's continue. To cultivate the faculty of seeing the invisible, we should often deliberately disentangle our minds. I love that. Disentangle our minds from the evidence of the senses. Okay, so we're gonna take our minds away from what we're taking in through our five senses in the three-dimensional world, right here, right? Take our minds out of that and focus our attention on an invisible state, mentally feeling it and sensing it until it has all the distinctness of reality. This paragraph right here is really, really juicy. There's a lot in there. Let's continue on here. Earnest, concentrated thought, focused in a particular direction, shuts out other sensations and causes them to disappear. We have but to concentrate on the state desired in order to see it. The habit of withdrawing attention from the region of sensation and concentrating it on the invisible develops our spiritual outlook and enables us to penetrate beyond the world of sense and to see that which is invisible. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. That's from Romans 1, verse 20. Let's continue. This vision is completely independent of the natural faculties. Open it and quicken it. Without it, these instructions are useless, for the things of the Spirit are spiritually discerned. A little practice will convince us that we can, by controlling our imagination, there it is again, controlled imagination. By controlling our imagination, we can reshape our future in harmony with our desire. That's big right there. By controlling our imagination, we can reshape our future to be in harmony with what we want. A desire is simply an emotionalized want. Then Neville goes on to actually talk about desire specifically. This is foundational stuff. This is the bedrock. Understanding this material is going to provide for you the foundation to be able to implement all of Neville's teachings. He says, desire is the mainspring of action. Desire is the mainspring of action. We could not move a single finger unless we had a desire to move it. No matter what we do, we follow the desire, which at the moment dominates our minds. You think about that. You go throughout a day. At any moment, all you're doing, right, is you're following the desire, which in that moment is dominating your mind. Right? So let's say that you're sitting on the couch. You have a couple options. You can get up and go and do a workout. You can get up and go to the fridge and get some food, right? So whichever of those two things, whichever of those desires is dominating your mind in that moment, that's what you're going to go and do, right? So your action is really, as he's saying here, driven by your desire. When we break a habit, our desire to break it is greater than our desire to continue in the habit. So if you're struggling to accomplish something, if you're struggling to form a new habit, let's say you're trying to get up earlier in the morning, right? Which is stronger, your desire to wake up earlier or your desire to stay in bed? Now, if you're struggling with this habit, as I have many times in my life and continue to this day a lot of the time, but if you stay in bed, all that means is that your desire to stay in bed is stronger than your desire to wake up and get to work or do whatever it is you want to do, right? And so to change that behavior, to shift that behavior, you have to figure out how to rebalance the two desires, how to create a scenario where your desire to get up is stronger, is more dominant in your mind than your desire to stay in bed. Let's continue here. The desires which impel us to action are those that hold our attention. A desire is but an awareness of something we lack or need to make our life more enjoyable. I love that definition there of a desire. I'll read it again. This is really important. Foundational concepts to understand here. A desire is but an awareness of something we lack or need to make our life more enjoyable. Desires always have some personal gain in view. The greater the anticipated gain, the more intense is the desire. There is no absolutely unselfish desire. Where there is nothing to gain, there is no desire, and consequently, no action. You can apply this concept to so many different contexts, but just remember, no desire, no action. So think about that with people you work with, people that you, maybe if you're in sales, people that you're speaking to, right? If they don't have a desire, they're not going to take action. You got to figure out what their desire is. If you're leading a team, people are driven by desire. And Neville's giving us a really clear description and definition of what desire is here in chapter 1 of Out of This World, back in 1948. Let's continue. The spiritual man speaks to the natural man through the language of desire. The key to progress in life and to the fulfillment of dreams lies in ready obedience to its voice. So the spiritual man, which is governed by focused imagination or disciplined imagination, right, speaks to the natural man. That's the version of you that's operating in physical form, three-dimensional world, five senses, through the language of desire. The key to progress in life and the fulfillment of dreams lies in ready obedience to its voice. So listening to the voice of the spiritual side of you with that controlled imagination. Unhesitating obedience to its voice is an immediate assumption of the wish fulfilled. Unhesitating obedience to its voice. What voice? That's the voice of desire coming from that controlled imagination. So when you've got a controlled imagination creating what it is you want, that's gonna elicit a voice with instructions almost that are gonna speak to you in the three-dimensional world. And it's gonna be your unhesitating obedience to those instructions, right, which will cause you to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, thus implementing the law of assumption, right? Neville says next here, to desire a state is to have it. As Pascal has said, you would not have sought me had you not already found me. Man, by assuming the feeling of his wish fulfilled and then living and acting on this conviction, alters the future in harmony with his assumptions. Assumptions awaken what they affirm. As soon as man assumes the feeling of his wish fulfilled, his four-dimensional self finds ways for the attainment of this end, discovers methods for its realization. His four-dimensional self. So what is your four-dimensional self? It's the element of you that is really anchored to to your imagination, your subconscious mind, your imagination, those higher mental faculties. I know of no clearer definition of the means by which we realize our desires than to experience in imagination what we would experience in the flesh were we to achieve our goal. This experience of the end wills the means. How do we experience the end? What does he mean by this? Right? This experience of the end, what does he mean? The end meaning the realization of the goal. So whatever it is you want, it's experiencing, the result or the outcome, your desired outcome, experiencing that in imagination and feeling it is going to will the means to actually produce that outcome in your physical reality. With its larger outlook, the four-dimensional self then constructs the means necessary to realize the accepted end. The undisciplined mind finds it difficult to assume a state which is denied by the senses. And I know that I wrestle with this all the time. This is something that I'm always working on. And I invite you to do the same, right? So we believe so strongly in the things that we see and touch and smell and taste and hear every single day that we're buying into our physical reality. And what Neville would say to that is that, if someone is completely only listening to their physical reality, that they've got an undisciplined mind. Because a disciplined mind is able to control the imagination, to transcend the five senses and create a new future in imagination. Feel that state, right? Feeling of the end, and then allowing the assumption of that feeling to provide the means, the instructions, the guidance to then bring back into the physical world and take the steps necessary to propel forward into the future, and then ultimately in physical reality realize the end that you had previously been experienced and realized in imagination. Now, I love when Neville, this next part here, I love when he actually breaks down techniques, provides instructions, because he doesn't always do that, which is one of the reasons why it's sometimes hard, it's challenging to implement Neville's work, because he doesn't always give clear instructions. But he does right here in chapter 1 of Out of This World. Here's a technique that makes it easy to encounter events before they occur, to call things which are not seen as though they were. People have a habit of slighting the importance of simple things, but this simple formula for changing the future was discovered after years of searching and experimenting. So here are Neville Goddard's instructions for implementing everything he's teaching in chapter 1 of Out of This World, written back in 1948. He says the first step in changing the future is desire. That is, define your objective. Know definitely what you want. That's step 1. Define your objective. Know what you want. So I invite you, I challenge you to do this right now. Write down, or at least bring to mind in vivid imagination what it is that you want, right? Bring to mind a goal, an objective, something that you want to create. Step 2, construct an event which you believe you would encounter following the fulfillment of your desire. An event which implies fulfillment of your desire. Something that will have the action of self-predominant, right? So you're going to think of an event, and I challenge you in this moment, don't think of this big, long event. Think of an event that you can imagine, create a mental movie that you can execute in 5 to 10 seconds. It could be a handshake or a high five or something that someone else who's close to you, something that they say to you. You want to create a really short event. Then finally, step 3, immobilize the physical body, right? So stop moving, sit still, and induce a condition akin to sleep. So don't actually fall asleep, don't have a nap, but get to that mental state that's just before you'd be sleeping, where you can still control your mind, still control the direction of your mind. You're going to lie on a bed or relax in a chair and imagine that you were sleepy. Then, with eyelids closed and your attention focused on the action you intend to experience in imagination, mentally feel yourself right into the proposed action, imagining all the while that you are actually performing the action here and now. This next part is really important. He doesn't always give this detail of instruction, but in this moment he does, and this is really, really important to execute when you go to do this. You must always participate in the imaginary action, not merely stand back and look on, but you must feel that you are actually performing the action so that the imaginary sensation is real to you. So don't just visualize yourself seeing that event happen, visualizing yourself doing it. You need to get into that imaginary place where you are participating. You are the doer in that imaginal act that you're playing out in your mind. It is important always to remember that the proposed action must be one which follows the fulfillment of your desire. And also, you must feel yourself into the action until it has all the vividness and distinctness of reality. For example, suppose you desired promotion in the office. Being congratulated would be an event you would encounter following the fulfillment of your desire. Having selected this action as the one you will experience in imagination, immobilize the physical body and induce a state akin to sleep, a drowsy state, but one in which you are still able to control the direction of your thoughts, a state in which you are attentive without effort. Attentive without effort, that part's key. Now, imagine that a friend is standing before you. Put your imaginary hand into his. First, feel it to be solid and real. Then carry on imaginary conversation with him in harmony with the action. Do not visualize yourself at a distance in point of space and at a distance in point of time being congratulated on your good fortune. Instead, make elsewhere here and the future now. I love this statement. Make elsewhere here and the future now. Bring that future bring that future event into the present through controlled imagination. The future event is a reality now in a dimensionally larger world. And, oddly enough, now in a dimensionally larger world is equivalent to here in ordinary three-dimensional space of everyday life. The difference between feeling yourself in action here and now and visualizing yourself in action as though you were on a motion picture screen is the difference between success and failure. This is there should be like warning lights, red alert, do not continue until you process this, until you understand what Neville's saying here. The difference between feeling yourself in action here and now versus just picturing yourself in action, like seeing yourself as though you're watching yourself on a movie screen, that's the difference between success and failure. The difference will be appreciated if you now visualize yourself climbing a ladder. And this is Neville's famous ladder exercise. Then, with eyelids closed, imagine that a ladder is right in front of you and feel you are actually climbing it. So this is an exercise to practice controlling the imagination. Think of your imagination like a muscle. This is a repetition. This is a way to get in the reps to build the muscle of controlled imagination. So he wants you to differentiate between visualizing yourself climbing a ladder versus imagining that ladder to be right in front of you where you're actually climbing the ladder. Desire, physical immobility bordering on sleep, and imaginary action in which self-feelingly predominates here and now are not only important factors in altering the future, but they are essential conditions in consciously projecting the spiritual self. If, when the physical body is immobilized, we become possessed of the idea to do something and imagine that we are doing it here and now and keep the imaginary action feelingly going right up until sleep ensues, we are likely to awaken out of the physical body to find ourselves in a dimensionally larger world with a dimensionally larger focus and actually doing what we desired and imagined we were doing in the flesh. But whether we awaken there or not, we are actually performing the action in the fourth dimensional world, and we will reenact it in the future here in the third dimensional world. Neville says, experience has taught me to restrict the imaginary action, to condense the idea, which is to be the object of our meditation, into a single act. This is what I was talking about before. You want to compress it, a small imaginal act, and to reenact it over and over and over again until it has the feeling of reality. So it's the repetition that's going to matter, not the length of that event in the first place. What he says is that otherwise, your attention will likely wander off along an associational track, right? Because we think through association. So if you don't condense the event and make it small and easy to repeat, then your mind's likely going to wander off into a different direction. And hosts of associated images will be presented to our attention. In a few seconds, they will lead us hundreds of miles away from our objective in point of space and years away in point of time. This is what he means. This is some of the detail that Neville's talking about when he says controlled imagination. He's saying that if you're not careful, it's really easy in the practice of this to allow your mind, to permit your mind to wander off into a different time and space entirely. And when you do that, you're not going to get the results or the benefit from this that he's describing here in this chapter of Out of This World back in 1948. If we decide to climb a particular flight of stairs because that is the likely event to follow the realization of our desire, then we must restrict the action to climbing that particular flight of stairs. Should our attention wander off, we must bring it back to its task of climbing that flight of stairs and keep on doing so until the imaginary action has all the solidity and distinctness of reality. The idea must be maintained in the field of presentation without any sensible effort on our part. We must, with the minimum of effort, permeate the mind with the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Drowsiness facilitates change. This is why he talks about the state akin to sleep so often. It's this part right here is explaining why this is so valuable. Neville says that drowsiness facilitates change because it favors attention without effort. Right? So you've got that focused attention, but you're not working so hard to maintain that. So if you get into that drowsy state, you can control the imagination without effort, because you want to be able to remove the effort. But it must not be pushed to the stage of sleep. So he's saying, don't fall asleep on me now. So do this, but be very careful you don't just doze off. This isn't nap time. Right? So do not allow yourself to be pushed to the stage of sleep in which we shall no longer be able to control the movements of our attention. Once you're sleeping, you're not controlling the movements of your attention anymore, but rather a moderate degree of drowsiness in which we are still able to direct our thoughts. A most effective way to embody desire is to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and then, in a relaxed and sleepy state, repeat over and over again, like a lullaby. I love that analogy. You want this to sort of feel like a lullaby, just kind of this imaginal act plays over and over in your mind. Any short phrase which implies fulfillment of our desire. So now you're bringing in the element of sound into the imaginal act, such as thank you, as though we addressed a higher power for having done it for us. If, however, we seek a conscious projection into a dimensionally larger world, then we must keep the action going right up until sleep ensues. So you want to almost keep this imaginal act over and over and over again, right up until the moment that you doze off. And this is how he's giving you instructions right here. He's giving us instructions as to how to fall asleep. This is Neville's instructions on how to go to sleep at night. Experience in imagination with all of the distinctness of reality what would be experienced in the flesh were you to achieve your goal, and you shall, in time, meet it in the flesh as you met it in your imagination. Feed the mind with premises, that is, assertions presumed to be true, because assumptions, though unreal to the senses, if persisted in until they have the feeling of reality, will harden into facts. To an assumption, all means which promote its realization are good. It influences the behavior of all by inspiring in all the movements, the actions, and the words which tend towards its fulfillment. To understand how man molds his future in harmony with his assumption, we must know what we mean by a dimensionally larger world. For it is to a dimensionally larger world that we go to alter our future. The observation of an event before it occurs implies that the event is predetermined from the point of view of man in the three-dimensional world. Therefore, to change the conditions here in the 3 dimensions of space, we must first change them in the 4 dimensions of space. To put it really simply, you need to, with this method, create your future in imagination using this technique, using controlled imagination. You create it before you experience it in the flesh. You can hear so many counts of people doing this, and I'm sure you've experienced this in your life too, where you've seen something happening before it actually happened in real life. Now, people do this accidentally all the time, and it's the study of Neville's work which allows us and actually teaches us how to do this intentionally, like on demand. That's what we're striving for, to really master this material and the implementation of it. Man does not know exactly what is meant by a dimensionally larger world and would no doubt deny the existence of a dimensionally larger self. He's quite familiar with the 3 dimensions of length, width, and height. And he feels that if there were a 4th dimension, it should be just as obvious to him as the dimensions of length, width, and height. A dimension is not a line. It is any way in which a thing can be measured that is entirely different from all the other ways. That is, to measure a solid fourth dimensionally, we simply measure it in any direction except that of its length, its width, or its height. Is there another way of measuring an object other than those of its length, width, and height? What Neville says is yes. The answer is time. Time measures my life without employing the three dimensions of length, width, and height. There is no such thing as an instantaneous object. Its appearance and disappearance are measurable. It endures for a definite length of time. We can measure its lifespan without using the dimensions of length, width, and height. Time is definitely a fourth way of measuring an object, any object, right? So already we have a fourth dimension. Time is a fourth dimension. The more dimensions that an object has, the more substantial and real it becomes. A straight line, which lies entirely in one dimension, acquires shape, mass, and substance by the addition of dimensions. What new quality would time, the fourth dimension, give, which would make it just as vastly superior to solids as solids are to surfaces and surfaces are to lines? Time is a medium for changes in experience because all changes take time. So the new quality is changeability. That's the new quality. So you have length, width, height, and changeability. Observe that if we bisect a solid, its cross-section will be a surface. By bisecting a surface, we obtain a line, and by bisecting a line, we get a point. This means that a point is but a cross-section of a line, which is, in turn, but a cross-section of a surface, which is, in turn, but a cross-section of a solid, which is, in turn, if carried to its logical conclusion, but a cross-section of a four-dimensional object. We cannot avoid the interference that all three-dimensional objects are but cross-sections of four-dimensional bodies, which means when I meet you, I meet a cross-section of the four-dimensional you, the four-dimensional self that is not seen. Now, obviously, this is getting more abstract, and this is one of the reasons why so many people dive into Neville's work. They get to stuff like this, and they start to go, okay, I'm lost. This guy's losing me. You know, my advice to you, whenever I get to passages like this in Neville's work, aside from just repetition, reading them over and over again, I sometimes surrender to these passages and just let these ideas kind of wash over me without working so hard to consciously understand and analyze every sentence and everything that Neville is actually writing here. So I encourage and invite you to do the same whenever you get to these passages in Neville's work that seem a little bit more abstract and not quite as simple to process and to understand. Let's continue on here. To see the four-dimensional self, I must see every cross-section or moment of your life from birth to death and see them all as coexisting. My focus should take in the entire array of sensory impressions which you have experienced on earth, plus those you might encounter. I should see them not in the order in which they were experienced by you, but as a present whole, because change is the characteristic of the fourth dimension, right? Changeability. I should see them in a state of flux as a living, animated whole. If we have all this clearly fixed in our minds, what does it mean to us in this three-dimensional world? It means that if we can move along time's length, we can see the future and alter it as we so desire. So he's explaining all this, giving us all this. There's a lot of theory, a lot of concepts here, which as he's going through it can seem like, well, what's he talking about here? Where's he going with this? This is where he's going, right? If we have all this clearly fixed in our minds, it means that if we can move along time's length, so we take time, the dimension of time, move along its length, we can see the future and alter it as we so desire. This world, this is what he means by thinking fourth dimensionally. This world, which we think so solidly real, is a shadow out of which and beyond which we may at any time pass. It is an abstraction from a more fundamental and dimensionally larger world, a more fundamental world abstracted from a still more fundamental and dimensionally larger world, and so on to infinity. The absolute is unattainable by any means or analysis, no matter how many dimensions we add to the world. Man can prove the existence of a dimensionally larger world simply by focusing his attention on an invisible state and imagining that he sees and feels it. If he remains concentrated in the state, and I like this part because now Neville's bringing all this theory, all these concepts back into practical application for the reader's benefit, for our benefit. So really focus in here. If you found this previous portion to be a little bit more abstract and harder to wrap your mind around, this is where you come on back, right? So come on back, focus in, because now he's bringing this all back to practical application, right? So you want to focus your attention on an invisible state and imagine that he sees and feels it. If he remains concentrated in this state, his present environment will pass away and he will awaken in a dimensionally larger world where the object of his contemplation will be seen as a concrete, objective reality. You'll realize your desire. Intuitively, now he's sort of speaking from the first person. Intuitively, I feel that. Were he to abstract his thoughts from this dimensionally larger world and retreat still farther within his mind, he would again bring about an externalization of time. He would discover that every time he retreats into his inner mind and brings about an externalization of time, space becomes dimensionally larger. And he would therefore conclude that both time and space are serial and that the drama of life is but the climbing of a multitudinous dimensional time block. Scientists will one day explain why there is a serial universe. But in practice, how we use the serial universe to change the future is more important, right? So even Neville's saying, we got to bring this back to practical application. And here he does it to end the chapter, to conclude chapter 1 of Out of This World, written back in 1948. This is the ending, right? The final phrase of chapter 1 of Out of This World. He says, to change the future, we need only concern ourselves with 2 worlds in the infinite series. The world we know by reason of our bodily organs, the world of the 5 senses, 3 dimensions, and the world we perceive independently of our bodily organs. And that is chapter 1 of Neville Goddard's Out of This World. Thank you for tuning in. We'll continue in our in-depth study of Neville's Out of This World. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications, and I'd love for you to drop a comment below this video right now and drop a comment and just let me know, what is your number 1 takeaway? What's the number 1 thing that you're taking away from chapter 1 of Neville Goddard's Out of This World, written back in 1948? I would love to hear the number 1 thing that you are going to take away and specifically implement and apply into your daily life. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.